Welcome. This morning I am reminded of the words of Harry Stamper, longshoreman, songwriter, who wrote the words, "We just come to work here, we don't come to die." The first National Day of Mourning was held in Canada in 1981 and was initiated by the Canadian Labour Congress. The Congress declared a National Day of Mourning for workers who were killed, suffered disease or injury, and as a result of occupational accidents and hazards. Every year since, unions, labor councils, and families and community partners have gathered to mourn. The date April 28th was chosen as the date because it was on the same day in 1914 that the first Workers' Compensation Act was passed. The federal government officially recognized the National Day of Mourning in 1991. Canada became the first country to recognize the day formally, and the International Day of Mourning was declared in 1996. Today, the International Day of Mourning is observed throughout the world in over 100 countries.
You know, I think the Day of Mourning is a vivid reminder for us that we can never give up the fight to protect workers. The recent events here in British Columbia have really highlighted the need for us to be ever vigilant. You know, as a member of the legislature, I know it's important for government to make sure that we are protecting worker safety as well.
But can think of why we celebrate the Day of Mourning. I think this week and this year clearly demonstrate that for us. While we won't know for some time, it appears, what caused the deaths and serious injuries of dozens of workers in both Burns Lake and Prince George, clearly the events have brought home for all of us, or should bring home for all of us, workers, the workers' compensation system, and employers, bring home for us the fact that we need to deal with safety issues and the issues which cause safety problems on our work sites. You know, we gather here today to mourn and to remember workers who went to work and didn't come home. Last year, 142 workers across BC ended up in this situation. In 2010, over 1,000 workers across the country did not come home from work. That's unacceptable. We think more can and should be done to end worker fatalities. We call on BC and our federal governments to do more to prevent these injuries and to not simply send condolences. And we call on our governments and our workers' compensation system to ensure that they understand who they are there to represent. Governments and our workers' compensation systems are there to protect and represent the interests of workers, not employers. And it seems all too often that sometimes that some need to be reminded of that. I also want just to spend a couple of minutes and talk about a bit of history. It was 20 years ago this year that the West Ray mine disaster occurred in Nova Scotia. 26 workers were killed instantly when an explosion occurred underground in that mine. Following that disaster, where it became clear through the inquiry that the deaths were caused by an employer who put profits before safety, the Canadian Labour Congress and the Labour Movement fought hard to ensure that we had criminal code provisions to hold employers accountable for safety violations on their work sites. But sadly, in the time since that has occurred, since those changes have been made to the criminal code, only 3 provinces have brought charges to bear. But since that time, since the West Ray mining disaster, 13,000 Canadians have lost their lives on the job due to injury, illness, and workplace accidents. Those 13,000 workers, they didn't get a chance to call home and say they were on their way home. They didn't get a chance to call home and to enjoy a retirement party, to retire in dignity. They're gone. But through events like this right across the country, we need to take steps to both remember those people who are no longer with us, but more importantly, to take action and to ensure those kind of events don't happen again.
Day of Mourning is an important day in the calendar for all people to remember that if you go to work in the morning, you should be able to come home at night. I enjoy coming to these events. It's an opportunity to meet with brothers and sisters, working people, and be reminded of why we have to get together and mourn the dead and fight like hell for the living.
I'm certainly have some insight as to why we're here today. Over the past 20-some years, I've attended many fatal and serious accidents in the province. Whether it was a 15-year-old worker by the name of Luke McIver who died of traumatic asphyxiation in Coquitlam as a result of being buried in the garbage, or last year in Oak Bay where a worker fell from a roof, a 70-year-old worker fell from a roof. None of these accidents get any easier to deal with. The fact remains that far too many workers die in the province of British Columbia. We need only stop to reflect upon the recent incidents in Burns Lake, as Brother has spoken about in Prince George, to realize the importance of the importance of safety in the workplace. But today I want to share with you the importance of why we should stop to honor the brothers and sisters who have died in the workplace. If we were on the shop floor, or if we were at Convention 4 this morning, and Brother O'Neill said to us all, what rights do we have as workers in the province of British Columbia? I think there would be a resounding response to say we have the right to refuse unsafe work, we have the right to participate, we have the right to no discrimination, and we have the right to know about the workplace equipment and tools that we're using. But what we need to ask ourselves is, where did these rights come from? To me, it's pretty apparent. The rights came on the backs of the workers, brothers and sisters who have gone before us. Those brothers and sisters gave up many times over the past years the responsibility that we have to exercise those rights. They gave the ultimate sacrifice in their lives. So I say to you, we must honor those sacrifices by exercising our rights in the workplace. We need to take ownership of these rights, and we need to defend those rights. We need to know and understand what the dangers are in the workplace. So if you're a member of a joint committee, or you're a foreman, lead hand, supervisor, whatever it may be, you need to ask yourself, do I know everything that I need to know to allow me to work in a safe workplace? We need to participate. We need to step forward and become a member of a joint committee, or become a team leader, or whatever it takes to allow us to make the workplace safe. And we certainly need to refuse unsafe work. That's a right that we've garnered for many years. It's language that's enshrined in the Act and the regulation. And we need to ensure that no one is discriminated if they bring forward those issues about health and safety in the workplace. Therefore, by exercising those rights, I think we can champion health and safety in the workplace to a level never seen before in the province of British Columbia. To me, it's about ownership. It's about taking ownership, and it's about doing something. It's about going back to our locals. It's about going back to the workplace and exercising those rights, that we never lose sight of why we're standing here today. As Mother Jones stated, mourn the dead and fight like hell for the living. Thank you.
I'm here at the Day of Mourning to recognize and respect workers, both those who we've lost as well as those who've been injured on the job. And this April 28th has a personal connection for me. My husband is chief of the Burns Lake Band, and one of his family members is one of the burn victims from the mill explosion in Prince George. Still recovering. I've seen a community on their knees, pulling together, trying to do everything they can to address what awful things have happened in that community. We have to remember the workers. We have to support those who are struggling, who are injured. We have to make sure we do everything we can. We can't stop until we know the workplaces are safe. It's something that we all need to pledge to do together. It's a responsibility of everyone in our province to make sure workers, when they leave for work in the morning, come home safely at the end of their day.
And I'd like to thank, in particular, CUPE Local 50 and the Victoria Labour Council for reminding us that the health, safety, and well-being of workers must be a central concern and a central responsibility of the labour movement itself. Over time, we've seen employers and governments introduce initiatives that replace the self-activity of workers with cumbersome and often bureaucratic apparatus. Often these procedures, as other speakers have mentioned, were designed to protect the interests of employers rather than the interests of workers. If we look at the workers' compensation system, which emerged in this province 100 years ago, the Workers' Compensation Act was specifically designed to limit the legal liability of employers. Workers and their families lost the right to sue employers for damages, for death or injury arising from negligence. In the decades leading up to the introduction of that law, more than 400 coal miners had died on this island, often as a result of employers such as Robert Dunsmuir cutting safety procedures in order to boost production and maximize profits. Today, unfortunately, we find that the basic relationships have not changed all that much. And in this era of cost-cutting, restraint, and austerity, we see the same basic problem, that employers are quick to ignore safety warnings, saving costs, while threatening the health and well-being and life of their workers who make the profits for them. The investigation of the Prince George incident is still ongoing, but I fear that we may find that this was a preventable tragedy, that the employer ignored warnings relating to the safety hazards of sawdust in the mill. I think this phenomenon, and without prejudging what happened in Prince George, I think it's often more convenient and more profitable to cling to a business-as-usual approach, but workers and their families can be devastated as a result. I think the Prince George incident and others like it suggest that we need much stronger enforcement of workplace safety warnings, and we have to examine much stiffer penalties, both criminal and financial, against employers whose actions or whose negligence contributes to the death or injury of their workers. And I think at the same time that we fight to strengthen laws and provide compensation and accommodation for employees, we need to remain vigilant in defending the principle of the right to refuse unsafe work, as the previous speaker said. And we need to uphold this principle whether or not it's embodied in statutes or in the language of collective agreements. There was an era of labor before the law when all actions by unions to advance the interests of workers were deemed criminal and punished with fines, injunctions, and jail terms. Sometimes basic humanitarian values, most notably respect for human life, runs up against laws enacted in employer-friendly legislatures. Such moments underscore the need for working-class self-activity to uphold community values. I'll conclude by thanking again CUPE Local 50 and the Victoria Labour Council for reminding us that workers can't always look to governments or employers to help them. In this era of austerity, the need for working-class self-activity and solidarity to improve conditions of life and work will become increasingly clear and increasingly essential. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm very proud and sad to be here today at the same time. Sorry that we have to have these kind of events, but very proud to be at the largest commemoration we've had in the history of Victoria. And what I think is most important to remember is that both the provincial and the federal governments like to talk about families first. And if we're going to talk about families first, the most important thing is that moms and dads, sons and daughters, brothers and sisters come home from work at the end of the day. So if they're really serious about families first, they need to pay a lot more attention to worker safety and make sure that we all get our loved ones back at the end of the day.
Sisters and brothers, ladies and gentlemen, we gather here today in Victoria and in dozens of communities across Canada to remember those that have been killed and died on the job in the last year, and the tens of thousands who were injured on the job. 142 families here in British Columbia, and we especially remember the events in Burns Lake and Prince George. Today, we remember all workers stricken with workplace illness, suffering injuries, or killed on the job. We remember children left without a parent and families facing hardship and deprivation. We remember young workers who are injured and killed at a much higher rate than other workers. We remember women workers whose hazards are often unrecognized or ignored by health studies. We remember the working wounded who are forced to continue to work because they are denied fair compensation. We remember families and friends who've had to nurse or care for ill or injured workers. Today, on April 28th, we remember the following members of our union, CUPE, who've died on the job since we last gathered 1 year ago. Sisters UT Merritt and Anne-Marie Chassis, members of Local 4021, lost their lives on the job as flight attendants on First Air Flight 6560 that crashed in Resolute, Nunavut, last August 22nd. We remember Brother Andre Lamoureux, an assistant director of our union, who was killed in a tragic motor vehicle accident in November of last year on the job. And we remember Sister Stephanie Chason, a member of Local 4939, Sir Thomas Roddick Hospital in Newfoundland, who died as a result of a domestic violence incident in her workplace just 2 months ago. Today, on April 28th, we mourn the dead and we pledge to fight for the living, and we make the following collective commitments. We vow that an injury to one is an injury to all. We demand the enforcement of health and safety laws. We denounce those who place profits before workers' health, and we proclaim our right to a safe workplaces and respect on the job. Thank you.
Annual Day of Mourning sort of hits a little closer home to me, having worked in the shipyard for many years, then working in our union office. I had to represent in front of WorkSafe BC, Workers' Compensation Board, one of my former co-workers who'd come down with diseases related to exposure to asbestos. Very long, painful process for the family. So days like this, I like to sort of pause and think about Ted McChesney. I had a lot of good times working with him, and it makes me think about what it means to other families, relatives, friends of people when they lose a loved one who, for one reason or another, doesn't come home from work or passes away due to a disease or illness related to what work they have done in the past. I believe governments have got to step up. We have not come anywhere near far enough to dealing with these issues. We need to continue the fight, and as we heard at the speeches today, we need to not only fight one day a year, we need to continue the fight every day of the year. I hope everybody will take more interest in these events. I think it's important that we try to get the younger people out, and by that I mean maybe getting some of the teenagers out of high schools involved in these things, maybe even doing events at the schools themselves. Anyway, it's been a pleasure being here today, and I look forward to being here again next year, God willing. Thank you.
I thank Brother Moise for his willingness to name names, and just so that we have on the record for today, the names of the two men who were killed in Prince George this week, Alan Little and Glenn Francis Roche.
And let me firstly thank the Labour Council and Local 50 for putting this event together, but most importantly, thank you for coming. You know, I've been to way too many of these events over the years, and it brings a couple of emotions to me. Sadness because I think when we have these kinds of tragedies, the phone call that's made to that household or that other workplace explaining that their son or their daughter or their father or their mother won't be returning home as a result of what happened at work. That sadness, that emotion, carries me to another level, and that level is anger. I feel a lot of anger when I hear the kinds of things that could have been, most likely could have been prevented. And when I hear in this province and across this country that a human life, for example, recently in the Lower Mainland, was valued at $35,000. Those are the kinds of fines when a worker gets killed on the job. My God, where are we going to if that's the case? My friends, I'm angry because these kinds of events need to continue. And there are numbers and stats, and you can read all about those things. But until we're not having these kinds of events, we can never stop fighting for the living. We can never stop because the next generation is dependent upon us to put rules in place in a work site that will never allow those tragedies to happen again. We need to fight as hard as we can to make sure governments understand that a human life is worth more than $35,000. We need to make governments understand that not only do you need to put regulations in place to make things work for working men and women, you need to enforce those laws. And if you choose not to abide by the law of the land, then it's not called, you're not going to bother filling out a form. You should be charged with attempted murder in this country. You know, it is unthinkable when we hear about the Burns Lakes and we hear about the Prince George episode that just took place. And those kinds of things are happening all the time. And the tens of thousands of injuries, disabling injuries that are happening, many of which will never be reported, many of which will never be recognized. Those kinds of things need to be realized. We need to recommit ourselves every April 28th, every June 28th, every May 28th, every day of the year, that it only takes one minor tragedy to upset not only a family, but a community. My friends, our commitment to you, to workers, from the 85,000 members I represent is, we will never stop fighting for the living, and we will always mourn the dead, but never stop fighting, my friends, never stop fighting. It's my honor right now to ask you all to take a moment to reflect on some of the things that you do at your work site, but most importantly, to recognize those that have been injured or killed on the job, if you would. Thank you, my friends. Remember, tomorrow is another day, a day to remember. April 28th is the day we get together. And for us all to continue to get together, April 29th, the fight needs to continue. Thank you all very much.
The day of mourning comes for workers killed and injured on the job. And I always think about them not seeing the spring. And I always think of that Walt Whitman poem that ends, "When lilacs last in the dooryard bloom, I mourn and yet shall mourn, forever returning spring. I mourn and yet shall mourn, forever returning spring."